You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm excited for you to hear from our two guests here today. We're sitting down with two really knowledgeable folks on the automotive industry and kind of the evolutions that may be ahead of us here. And we're going to dig into a lot of those different subject matters. But sitting down with fellow Methodite Blair Holt and also Josh Batie. And Josh is the Vice President of Autonomous Vehicles and Aviation Mobility at Toyota Motors of North America. So thank you both for joining us here today. And I just want to call out for the folks who maybe are unaware, this is taking place right after a tech talk that we just had. So as we're listening to this podcast, if this is a subject matter that really is of interest to you, jump over to our YouTube channel. We've got that whole recording will be up there for you to dig in more. And that'll also be featuring previous podcast guest of ours, Evangelos Samudi, along with Josh as they dig into some of that subject matter. So again, if that's something that's of interest to you, welcome you to jump back in.
This is a multimedia enterprise.
It is. We're just pushing content out everywhere. Anyways, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Blair, I know you just had a great conversation again with the Tech Talk with Evangelos and Josh. So I'll hand it off to you here just to get us started and give us a little bit of a recap on the Tech Talk, but then also we'll jump right into the conversation there.
Yeah, I mean, just recap wise, I think we were able to dig into a lot of really interesting spaces. We were joking beforehand, we don't get to talk about cars enough in Charlotte. And Evangelos was a great starting point for us because he's written a few books, and this latest one around software-defined vehicles and autonomous vehicles and electrification and how those things are coming together to really change the paradigm of the customer experience, both in how we buy cars and how we use cars and how we think about mobility more broadly. So that was an amazing discussion, and I really appreciate having a little bit of extra time with Josh. I did want to start just by talking about your background, Josh, because you lead some pretty heady work at Toyota, right? Like you literally work on flying machines, you work on autonomous vehicles, you're trying to figure out how to do it at scale. I mean, it's a very strategic job, but you came up in the world of dealerships and sales, right?
Yes.
So I guess tell me a little bit about like how you got from here to there.
I guess a little bit of luck, but in a sense, I grew up in the industry. Family owned car dealerships. Went to college, never thought I'd get back in the business. Went to Arizona State, and I actually think I showed up in my interview for Toyota in a hula shirt. And I have been told the only reason I actually got the job is that I said my first truck was a Toyota pickup truck, and it is my favorite truck I've ever had. And I met the lady after they'd eventually hired me for some god-awful reason. And she's like, yeah, that kind of stuck out in her mind. I was like, yeah, that and probably the fact that I was still wearing a hula shirt from the night before.
The shirt wasn't the one that
it might have been that, might not have been. I don't know. Toyota put me through, they have a way of cultivating their leaders. And it really turns down two tracks, the R&D track, to your point, or the sales and operations track. And I was on the sales and operational track. It was natural. Got to spend time really learning the business from the inside out. But at the same time, I had the ambitions to maybe get my hands on the joysticks and operate one of these car companies.
Yeah.
And I took a leap and went and worked for a company called Fisker Automotive. It was one of the coolest things and the most scary things I've ever gotten to do in my life in the startup world. You run it up one side and down the other. But I got a chance after a series of roles to come back to Toyota. And it was there that Toyota was taking this opportunity to say, okay, from a leadership standpoint, we want to start to see if we can migrate people around the company to cross-pollinate. So you'd have people with these deep backgrounds, but how do you create leaders of the future whereby you move them around within the pillars of Toyota, whether it be finance or manufacturing, R&D, sales, and technology. And I got the opportunity to jump on the technology side. And I just saw this as a chance, at least from a product standpoint, to say, oh, wow, I understand our dealers and customers, but I also get to work with this really cool technology that's the future and how that's all going to get meshed together in a way that makes people's lives better.
Yeah.
And so for me, I love the defining the what, that product side of it. And so my joke is I've never written a line of code in my life. Couldn't even tell you how. But I can tell you what we're doing from a technology standpoint for our customers is going to be great.
I really love that unique combination of perspectives, being able to speak to sales and ops on one side and also strategy and technology on the other. I think it probably gives you a bit of a pragmatism. And one of the things that you had shared with me when we first spoke was you came in as a little bit of like a skeptic on automation when you started the role. And I'm interested in hearing like how that journey went for you, and like what are the things that you saw that were like, you know what, this might actually work.
I think with anything else, it's the experience, right? I'd seen it from afar. I'd been in a car with a safety driver in it, that it was on a predetermined route. And I knew what we were talking about. We were talking about fleet vehicles. And so in the back of my mind, I knew the math behind fleet vehicles. I knew the percentage of vehicles that Toyota sells that are fleet vehicles versus personally owned vehicles. So I'm going, okay, the math is small, the tech's not there yet. And then, as I've shared with you, I got to have this experience where I hopped in the back of a Waymo. First time, it pulls up, it looks like the Ghostbusters car, and it has, "Hi Josh, this is your ride," written on the box on the top of it. And you get in and you're like, you have that moment of like, oh my God, I'm not driving. I'm back here, you're up there. Computer, you got the wheel. And I looked at my colleague that was with me. I was like, we're going to do it. All right, let's go. And about 5 minutes in, I said, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Like, this isn't on protected roads. I mean, you're just going from
this
the
is
airport
from the airport heading towards Arizona State, and 75,000 students staring at their phones, walking around aimlessly. And I'm going, wow, this is going to be the true test. So we're doing 55, I think, down a major thoroughfare. We get into Tempe. It navigates through several stoplights and crosswalks and nonsense. And I get out and I'm like, that's going to change the world.
Yeah.
Because it was smoother. There was a point at which on that ride I said, oh, I get how they're getting away with this. We aren't doing the speed limit. So I lean up and look over at the dials. We're spot on the speed limit. But because it was being electronically controlled throttle, it was smooth. Like it was glass.
Yeah.
It gave me the sense that I wasn't even going the speed limit. So it was just a series of events there where, and I think you do, like on the product side of things, you should be a skeptic. But you can also have those moments where you're like, okay, this works.
There's something here.
There's something here.
As I mentioned before, we had Evangelos on a previous podcast. You spent a lot of time with him recently, and that's one of the things that he kind of gets into is that the tug of war that takes place with knowing how quickly we are now able to move with technology, but also playing that tug of war game. To your point earlier, when you had mentioned, hey, we're working on like a 7-8 year timeline with these vehicles. And so how do you go about making sure that you are doing it responsibly so that the tech's not out in front too far, but also that the vehicle itself isn't being manufactured in a way that's holding it back?
I think it's even more pronounced for Toyota in the sense that this company's built on quality. That's our cornerstone.
Yeah.
So walking that walk is a very fine line. You want to push technology, and we're cautious at how we go about it, and it's intentionally cautious.
Mm-hmm.
So you may not always see us be the first, but we're typically the best when we get there.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the decision-making structures that are in place. Like you're already at an automaker, and so there's going to be a certain decision-making structure. And then Toyota on top of that, valuing the quality of what it produces so highly. So like, how do you even have the right discussions around something like software-defined vehicles where you're having to build in adaptability and flexibility and maybe even ceding a little bit of control?
Very hard.
That an engineering-led company isn't used to.
It's definitely not used to it. The speed at which it happens is different. So it's making these type of updates on vehicles is not easy. We were talking in between lunch and today, we were talking about version control. Because so much of the quality of what you're now getting is digital quality, right? And so making sure that a customer is on the most current version of their software. Mm-hmm. It's just like your iPhone. Sometimes you get an update where it's draining all the power out overnight. Okay. Yeah. And they'll come back the next Monday, and sure enough, they'll hit you with an update and it's all fixed. Well, it's only all fixed if you get the update. So helping customers go through that, so that it's definitely a shift. And but I will say this, while it may feel torturous being on the inside of it, it's the right way to be in the sense that we're doing things with the intent of making sure that it's Toyota quality, but at the same time delivering you the value and the product you'd expect. So even though it's more torturous for us, in the end, it's going to be a much better outcome for a customer.
And do you think, going back to as you're talking about the quality, and that is something that Toyota's built an incredible brand on, is that these vehicles last forever. From a software-defined vehicle perspective, does the fact that your product is so reliable and has such a long shelf life, does that ultimately have the potential to create long-term problems as far as how you can continue to downrange support future software? I'm assuming that's got to be a
It's kind of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
It's problems and opportunities.
Okay.
So the more you limit, the less you could either fix or add to, meaning add an additional service or new feature or what you're capable of going back and improving upon that you didn't get right the first time.
Yeah.
So yes, those are the guardrails per se that you're going to have to put on yourself. So those are the decisions that, and honestly, you asked a question a moment ago of how are you going about, right now I think every OEM is going through the same process of how do you certify and make sure that what you've built when it goes out is the right thing for the customer. The amount of work that's going into redefining our quality process is amazing. And our teams are doing an outstanding job because, again, they said it in the earlier meeting, they're still building parts of this while they're flying the 747. So they're building the Concorde while they're flying the 747 at the same time, which is no easy task. And so, yeah, my hat goes off. Those teams work round the clock.
What do you think about the trade-off between like certification of a quality product versus providing personalization and customization at an individual level? Like, how do you know what to give control to and what to keep control of?
I think that's the debate that'll go on forever.
Right.
But I think safety and regulatory is a non-negotiable,
Yeah.
right? You don't get a say in that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that leaves you into the what's after that you are allowed to prioritize or unprioritize. And so I think it's almost case by case we look at them.
Yeah.
And say, is this the right feature? What are the pros? What are the cons? Who's it going to affect? Who's it not going to affect? What's the size of the population? What's the value this brings versus what are the risks it creates? So it's from a decision-making process, it's not easy. And like anything else, you talked about it with new technology, it will get smoother over time. You know, from talking to my other colleagues at other OEMs, we're not alone in this. It's something that we're all going through right now because, again, this used to all be arguments about head gaskets and brake rotors and other. This is a discussion now about a technology that's relatively new to everybody to have to work on.
I was curious to get your take because when we spoke with Evangelos on the podcast, one of the things that he talks about in that book is, and you mentioned it a little bit as well, is this idea that the days of the bigger, more powerful engine, the new refined design, like those are still going to play a role, but their importance is diminishing with the buyer in a lot of ways. And so the question that I've got there is, as you guys are working through that and starting to see, hey, the motor head, the gear head that we've kind of built decades of legacy on with like racing and all that, we're moving into an era where a lot more folks are more focused on the customizability of it or the in-cabin experience versus the on-road performance. And so I guess the question in there is, how are you guys tackling that as far as like if you're putting your fortune teller hat on, like where do you see that road taking us ultimately from the perspective of how much do you lean into the in-cabin customization or are there other things that you are seeing as being like, hey, this needs to be a priority as we move forward?
Well, I'll take it to AV. And I was with you. I said, oh, this new world's going to be all about in-cabin. But then when my role really pivoted to focused on AV in the last 6 months, what I recognized is we started bringing in some of the top engineers. I mean, when I say top engineers of drivability to come sit in the May Mobility EVs or AVs and the Aurora vehicles, and they would test drive the Waymos. And they started talking about how it felt in your butt again, like how the car felt and how it turned and how it anticipated. And it was this moment where I was like, oh, wow, we've kind of gone full circle here.
Okay.
In the sense that now because we're handing the wheel over to somebody else, we're all the way back to feeling, what does this feel like to you? Because one of the biggest issues you're going to have, I talked about that moment when I got in the AV for the first time and I was like, but it was so smooth and I had confidence in it. And all of a sudden my anxiety went way down. Well, a lot of that anxiety going down is how that car feels. You're looking out as a rider. Here's how I described it. Let's just go back to my daughter as an example. If she's looking at her phone and driving and I'm looking over there, I have no confidence in her. And I can feel the car underneath me doing things it probably shouldn't be doing because she's looking at her phone.
Yeah.
That's what they're measuring. And when I got in that Waymo, my anxiety went down because even though I couldn't see the physical driver, I got the sense that like this thing has it under control.
You felt safe.
I felt safe. I felt like it was the other thing it was using. This is an interesting piece for at least for me on the autonomous vehicle side. I never thought of it till that ride. Were the screens in the vehicle, and you think, oh, screens are going to be the future. However you play your music or media or whatever. No, the screens were my ability to look over at the driver. The screens were showing me, because you can see it identifies pedestrians and other vehicles. The screens are telling you what the car is seeing. And that also felt my anxiety drop dramatically. So I'm looking at it going, okay. In fact, we got up to a street where it was going from about 3 lanes to 5 lanes, 2 of them being left-hand turn, right-hand turn. Crosswalk, people everywhere, people changing lanes. And you can see the vehicle had a really good idea of what it wanted to do near term. It was fixed. But the second layer out, it was bouncing its arrow back and forth. You think, oh no, it doesn't know what. No, that was great. It gave me the sense that like it's got this first problem solved and it's trying to figure out what it's going to do for that second one.
Well, it's interesting because I've never been inside of one of the vehicles before, but I'm assuming the way that you're describing it, keep me honest but for our listeners who maybe also have never been inside of one of these things, it sounds like what you're describing is this vehicle has 6, 7 sets of eyeballs that are all processing everything simultaneously, where you and I are on the road. We've got 2, right? And oftentimes, and unfortunately, I've on occasion got a very unhappy co-pilot who makes me aware of things that I may or may not already be aware of.
That's correct.
And but when you're describing it like that, you do start to realize like, oh, okay, the amount of energy that provides as far as safety is concerned is pretty impressive.
I never recognized how much it meant to be able to visualize what the car was planning on doing and transitioning that to what I was feeling from the seat.
Yeah.
And that's where, kind of going full circle back to your question, that marriage of the digital and the physical will never go away.
Yeah.
Because it was those 2 things put together where I was like, all right, it sees that person jaywalking and it's already made a decision here and it's thinking about what it's got to do there.
Yeah.
I'm good with that because I wouldn't do any more myself at this point. It's beyond what I would have done.
Yeah.
So I think there's some pieces to this. We talked earlier about kind of the fiasco with the Hertz Tesla.
And for the folks who maybe haven't heard that, can you do a brief recap?
Yeah, so keep me honest here. Maybe a year and a half ago, Tesla and Hertz announced a fleet partnership whereby Tesla would sell 60 to 75,000 fleet units to Hertz. Hertz's intention was to make those vehicles available to Uber drivers. With the logic, it was sound logic on Tesla's behalf that an Uber driver would learn how to drive one of them. And secondly, they're packing 2 or 3 people in the back seat every 5 minutes, and that's exposure to their product. Great idea, poor execution. I think, though, if you just step back and say, don't even think about the outcome of that. If you were to use that same shift, when will AV become that? I said it, go sit in one of these companies that's pretty far ahead, a May Mobility, a Waymo, and experience it. And the more people that do, that's where the tipping point's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I mean, Tesla's still fighting for the tipping point right now, believe it or not. That to me tells you a year and a half ago, they were still fighting for the tipping point. So it's going to take time for AV, but I think every person that sits in one of these, we've had some very high leadership come over from Japan. And after they've come, they've said they've tapped all of their captains underneath them, get on a plane and go over there and experience this. Okay. So they see it and they believe it, and I understand why.
I think the the adoption challenge for AV, which you described very well. It is a visceral experience to be in these cars, right? And you need to be able to hit that emotional wavelength for people to be like have their anxiety go down.
Yep.
But I experienced this Hertz Tesla thing. I rented one in Tampa, and like the challenge for EVs is different, which is that no, you are asking me to operate this vehicle, and all you've done is given me the keys. This is a completely different product that I don't really know how to use yet. I certainly don't know how and where to refuel it.
I did it in Phoenix in the summer. I rented one, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you got 245." No, in the heat with the AC blasting, and I'm sitting there watching this thing. Good friend of mine and I were, racing down, and we're like panicking, trying to find a fast charger, and of course they're full, and there's people out to the road with. Been there.
It's a totally different kind of anxiety. And so there's a huge education. Just forget about the charging infrastructure, which we could spend an hour on, but just like the education to understand what it is that I'm driving now and how it's different. That feels like a huge thing that the industry's got to figure out, dealers have to figure out, car makers have to figure out. And that was like the miss with Hertz, right? Is that you're just throwing keys at people and like they're coming away from that experience less confident in something which like, once you get used to it, you figure it out is a pretty delightful experience.
Well, yeah. Think about owning them's a lot different, right? Because owning them, you got a charger set up in your house. Like you're coming in every night, popping it on the charger. No, you're throwing the keys at somebody that's probably going to head down to the Marriott, park it there, use it for a couple of days, and like have no idea where to find a public charger, how to sign up for one, how to use it. I lived through the fiasco as well. And the buddy of mine that rented it, he had a lot of choice words. I'll have to have him watch this podcast and have a good laugh at it because him and I, we had the windows down driving down freeways in Phoenix last summer because we didn't want to run the air conditioner.
Trying to keep the range up?
Keep the range up long enough to make it to a charging station.
I'd be interested to hear what is Toyota's take. Like when you guys are looking at the landscape with EVs for the last number of years have just been on every headline, right? And then just recently, probably within the last 6 to 8 months, that story that we've been hearing over and over has started to shift a little bit. The little bit of the wind has been taken out of the sails. My understanding was that Toyota wasn't fully, I don't want to say bought in, but weren't really like running with the momentum as hard as everybody else was. And so to some extent, it feels like you guys are vindicated a little bit in kind of how slow you were, not slow playing it, but just kind of cautiously moving forward with things. Can you talk a little bit about what is the stance on that and kind of why was that approach taken?
It's just more of a timing piece. It's how fast would the industry migrate away from internal combustion engine to a completely electric platform. And Toyota's always had the belief that the hybrid would be this gradual walk into it.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a little anecdote about one of our senior executives on the Toyota side, Bob Carter. He retired last year, but we were working with him on setting up the app for the BZ4X that Toyota launched. Mm-hmm. And so we were showing him the EV app and we were having a discussion with him about it. He goes, I got to tell you a story. He goes, I got my wife a plug-in RAV4 hybrid. And, it does a certain amount of mileage on EV only. And he goes, she's had it probably 1,600 miles. He goes, she called me the other day. Her and her lady friends had been down to play golf in Fort Worth and were on their way back. And she goes, Pop, my car's making this horrible noise. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is. And he's like, just get home. I'll check it out when I get home. And he got home and the engine had come on.
This is so great.
It was the first time she'd ever heard the engine come on in the car. So that just tells you, like, from a perception of like how much people actually use their vehicle on a given day-to-day basis. That's why the hybrid piece makes all the sense in the world, is this gradual migration of where we should be.
I'm interested to know, like, the slower pace of EV rollout. Does that affect the pace of automation technology, or are you able to do that on like hybrid powertrains just as well?
We could do it on hybrid powertrains just as well. It's not as easy. I think a lot of the reason it's a lot easier to control throttle on an EV. And then secondly, the platform itself basically offers you the same. So you really, though, only want to have to create it once. That's the bigger thing, is the cost of designing those controls for multiple different platforms.
Oh,
is
interesting.
tricky.
Yeah. I would have figured, like, if for no other reason, I'm having to worry about two different powertrains. Right?
That's the point, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting challenge.
But the EV gives it that smooth feeling. It's the same feeling you have because there's no shift points, right?
Sure.
So that feeling of acceleration is much easier to be controlled.
Yeah. But I mean, for you guys, this has always been a question of when, not if, right? So
That's
it's just
correct.
about aligning the timing of all of those different.
Correct. And probably even the bigger piece for us is the right car. You still have to go back to saying, okay, what's it going to be used for? Like May Mobility is using our Sienna vans for microtransit in Arizona. Okay, great. Well, a two-seater is not going to be perfect for that. You want a larger vehicle that maybe has wheelchair access, but at the same time, you're seeing mandates move towards EV, so some cities wouldn't approve them if they weren't an EV. So you have these balances, right, of like what physically does the car need to do and what is required of the car to do, and then lastly, what's going to allow the car to perform the best. So it's a bit of a balancing act there.
So if I think about, and Toyota is certainly one of these, if I think about OEMs shifting the way that they talk about themselves from car makers to mobility providers, right? I think there's a lot of traditional OEMs that are sort of reframing themselves to a certain extent to that. Like, how do you actually make that play? I mean, it seems like you, whether it's owning fleets or not, these companies have to get better at things that they're not good at today. They have to build muscles that they don't have today. They have to think outside the context of a very well-established paradigm.
Correct.
So, like, how do you figure that out?
I was talking with a gentleman after our earlier discussion because we hit on this about 3 times in the lunch dialogue, which was everything took longer than we thought.
Right.
And it's these tiny little steps. But one of the things we landed on as a mobility group is saying, all right, take all the noise out of it. It's about getting people from A to B. If I can get you from A to B, a person or service or good, from A to B, I've done my job. And then you start having to peel back that onion. Do you do that by paying for it by mile, by hour, month? Permutations are pretty endless. But at the same time, it's, if you look at the European model, full service lease dominates. At what point, and when you think about your iPhone, it's pretty much a full service lease.
Right. So maybe it's not as big a leap as you
would think, right?
Yeah,
the US market's just never been really had an appetite to go there. But if you were to think, I lease my car from Toyota, I use Toyota-based insurance. Now I'm starting to get down that path of, I'm fuel away from being a full service lease at that point.
Yeah.
And that's where I do think you're still going to see the onset of companies that are going to need to be there to help manage these fleets from a digital standpoint. I think that companies like RideCell and others are still going to have an important part because at some point you're going to have this technology that comes to the market and a fleet owner that's one of the rental car companies that's really good at doing it the old way but have never waded into the pool. And they're going to need a system of tools, too, to help them manage that.
Yeah.
Which will be a whole nother layer of fun we get to figure out.
So I wanted to touch.
Are you guys exhausted after hearing what we're trying to work? Like,
I'm tired.
I am tired, too. And I'm like, shoot, we do a lot of stuff. And I'm getting... Like, I'm kind of making mental notes in the back of my head of, like, stuff I need to do when I get back on the plane to go home tonight. And I'm like, oh, we got to look at that again.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Keep going because it's probably things I should have been looking at a long time ago.
Well, I'm going to load you up with another layer because I wanted to get your thoughts on the retail model. And one of the things that you and I were joking about before was, like, they've been predicting the demise of the dealership model for 20 years, for a generation. And it's proven to be very resilient. And I think you're seeing some weak signals that is being disrupted as you've got new entrants that come in that aren't weighted by the dealer covenant.
Right.
And they have an opportunity to do things from scratch. And you have very new technology platforms. I mean, the essence of the car is different than it was before. And so who needs to educate on it and sell it and service it might be fundamentally different. Like, is there a point at which those signals are going to come together and we're really going to have to think differently about the dealership model?
I truly don't believe so. I think that they have shown their resiliency. They could have been by the wayside a long time ago, but they don't. They keep evolving. And I think, honestly, this is one of the reasons that I chose to rejoin Toyota is I recognize the respect they have for people, one, but the respect they have for their dealers and that it's a partnership.
Yeah.
And that OEM partnership with dealers isn't equal in all other OEMs.
Mm-hmm.
Toyota does it in a way where they're always working together on what that next step should be with their dealer body. What should we be working on next? I wish that people could see inside. You know, they have a dealer council where 15 or 20 dealers are representing nationally the Lexus and Toyota dealers. And it's an amazing dialogue if you ever get to see one or hear about it. I've sat through them, and it's a true partnership. And it's them saying, hey, we think we're going to need help on this. And it's us saying, hey, this is coming. How are we going to do this together?
Yeah.
And I know that's a big picture way of talking about it, but at the same time, that's the start of those conversations of, we're worried about this. We need your help with that. We need to pivot to this. Can you do that? And it's two groups working together. It doesn't feel hierarchical. Doesn't feel like one is on top of the other. It feels like it's two groups that are, hey, we're in this together with our dealer body. We know that this industry is going through a massive upheaval, and we're going to figure this out together. It's amazing when you're on the Toyota side, the dealer question doesn't come up. And if it does come up, it goes away very fast. And I don't think it comes up because people are afraid to talk about it. I think it doesn't come up because it's almost viewed, at least, you know, I've been in 2 other OEMs now, and I've also consulted for 3 others. And I've seen inside the walls, and it's always a little bit of a hierarchical. This is not that. This is seen as, hey, I can't count how many times, and I've started actually doing this with some of my tech teams, is, you know, when you're on the sales teams, they'll say, hey, we think we can get the dealers to do this. Does that work? And a good leader at Toyota will say, I don't know, get in your car and drive over and ask them.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
Go talk to them and sit with them and figure it out together.
Yeah.
And it's funny because that's starting to work with our technology teams too. It's been one of the biggest takeaways you talked about when we first started talking about my role here. I showed up, I felt like I was making phone calls every day saying, hey, Fred's got to come out. He wants to ask you about this project. Jenny's coming out. She's working on this. Can you take a look at it with her? Gimba.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was a really good, healthy thing because it gets people out from behind the screen and gets them to go live in the real world to say, okay, we got to solve this charging problem. Let's think about how this is going to work at the dealership. All right, sales, service, okay. And you start to map it out, and they have all those aha moments that you wouldn't have on a conference call. That's the breed that Toyota brings, and I think that's what's going to ultimately make it successful and make it stick.
I know we're talking specifically from the dealership experience here, but on another podcast we've done with Jason Rome, he's brought up a number of times, pushing leadership. Get your people into the field, secret shop, everything, the whole experience. Get your hands on it, experience it, see what you like, what you hate, why. And so that you come back and make, and it kind of sounds like you're kind of doing the same thing. Like, let's not make any assumptions about what the dealers will or won't do or what they can or can't do. Like, we need to go confirm everything and figure out maybe we've got solutions they haven't even thought of. So
The gentleman I work for he's always asking me, Gimba, did you Gimba? And I better have answered that the right way. But I've also seen where Daisuke Toyota came to town and he Gimmed.
Yeah.
And I mean, so it's all levels, right? There should be nobody that's below it, right? Go experience it. Go walk a mile in those shoes, and you'll figure out really quick how to help solve those problems. And I think that's pretty indicative of the company.
One of the proof points that you had shared with us earlier is like, if you want to see a dealer change fast, throw a pandemic at them, and they'll figure out how to do home delivery pretty darn quick, because that's how you're going to sell a car. And so like that, rising to the challenge, if there's a burning platform out there, and so if this happens to be it, then they'll figure it out, right?
And they did a great job of it. Had some of the most successful years they've ever had as a group collectively. And so I wish I could have the hundreds of hours back we worked on, digital transformation with them and everything leading up to the pandemic. I could have a whole year of my life back.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes it takes that kick. that outside pressure that ultimately, but the reaction to it was beyond impressive in my opinion.
Yeah.
Pandemic's still bad. Just that's the
correct.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Let's skip the pandemic next time. Just
Right.
go straight to the digital transformation. Like, can we just skip all of that?
Yeah. I want to make Josh make a prediction, which is like
shoot.
we're going to have you back here, 2034. Okay. Check your calendar, 10 years from now.
All right.
And I want you to predict one thing that you think is going to be fundamentally different about the automotive experience, and one thing that is not going to be different.
As much as we talk about it, I think people will still want the freedom of their car. I just don't see that going away. I see people as...
And just to clarify, their car or like, does it have to be like their own?
I don't want to clarify that, but
Okay.
that's the freedom of it. Yeah. I personally would still want to have my own vehicle, but I recognize that I'm seeing things through my own lens.
Yeah.
But the freedom of being able to go where they want to go, do what they want to do on their own terms, maybe we put it that way, is still going to be there. Whether that's the freedom to be able to grab an Uber and get across town in San Francisco, or the freedom to have my gas guzzling half-ton truck that beats my Honda Pilot.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think people are still going to want to have that. The thing that I think will change is the hardest part, and I think this goes back to everything we've talked about today, is I'm starting to learn that it's really hard to predict what you're going to want. You're going to have to prepare for what you want. Meaning, I think you're going to see companies start making big strides to building these cars where they have the ability to be improved in the future. And that's from a safety standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, but also an experience standpoint. And so I think that's the biggest one you're going to see, is that throughout generations of owning a car, just like maybe when you bought your car, you put larger tires on it or you modify it to be something personalized. I think that you'll see a car be able to evolve over time with different owners to meet their different needs. And it may not look like the car that rolled off the line. And that's the part that I think is going to be the biggest shifter for us. I know those are probably MBA answers that probably beat around the bush a little bit, but I think people are going to want to change their cars. I don't think that's going to go away. But I do think, it's interesting because they talk about it at my daughter's school a lot that kids aren't signing up to get their driver's license on their 16.
It's true.
Like, I was in line, ready to walk in, like I was ready.
Yeah.
And it's just not, the appetite's not there. And I said, that'll come back. I don't think that, maybe this generation's different. I don't know, but I just think that freedom is, it's what it was all about in the beginning. I don't think that'll ever change. So.
Human nature. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
You're obviously doing a lot of work on the autonomous vehicle side of things, but what do you think is the appetite as far as how that gets adopted on a personalized level? Like, I want a vehicle, but I don't want to have to drive it, but I want my vehicle. Like, do you see that like becoming, or do you think that's going to be, for the short term, is it going to be limited more towards like fleet vehicles or like ride share, or what does that look like in your mind?
I think it's going to have to inch its way in. So it'll find the easiest, right now I think we're finding the easiest points of entry for autonomous vehicles. But we've even started saying, okay, if we want a personally owned vehicle with level 4 autonomous on it, does that mean you plug in an address when you leave your house to come to Method in the morning and it drops you off here? Or is it knows that the freeway entrance to freeway entrance, or is it, there's so many different pieces to this, right? And when you start to think about it in terms of permutations, we've been playing around with this idea of, the trucking piece should take off. One of our partners, Aurora, is working not only on our vehicle side, but on a trucking platform with Volvo. And their premise there is they can run trucking day and night on 25 to 30 different routes. It's highly lucrative. Trucking's regulated. You can't drive more than whatever hours. That's a really good jumping off point for a high speed autonomous vehicle. Now you can do that permutation into, okay, some type of exit ramp to exit ramp, personally owned vehicle. And you can start to see how these trickle down. But to your point of, and we've talked about it through the ownership or even the utilization of these vehicles, I think that eventually it'll cover all types and sizes, but you'll see it inch out based on how the technology advances.
And I'm going to put you on the hot seat. You kind of
I've been there.
Put you on piggyback off
Yeah.
of Blair's kind of comment. If you had to put a year on it, how far out do we have to go before you start to see autonomous vehicles as like it's no longer weird to see that in somebody's garage
30.
30 years from now?
No, 2030.
Oh, 2030.
Josh you don't want to drive anymore. See, you were trying to peg whether or not Josh Lucas was a pilot or a tundra. He's actually a chauffeured limo guy. That's who he
awesome.
actually is.
I'm with you. I always was trying to gauge things. My son is 12, so he's my last one. And I'm always like, is he going to drive or not? Will he be driving?
Yeah.
Right?
I even got one for you. My daughter's going through driver school right now. And, on our Sequoia and our Tundra, we have the screens, when you put it in reverse. It's like a video game, right? I mean, it's 14 inches, and it shows you all the way around the car, and there's things turning and show you where you're going. Giant red lights going off when you get even close to something. It's not the old days of like using your mirrors and over your shoulder and all that stuff. So my question is, if she takes our cars to the driving test, does she get to use all that stuff, or does she have to do the nonsense that they want her to do? Like, do they turn all the screens off?
Oh, well, there's an answer. There's an answer to that question, right? I don't know what it is.
I don't know
but...
the answer. I've got to find out this answer.
Wow.
Well, or if you pass the driving test on one of those vehicles, should you be
Do you get a special?
permitted
Yeah,
to-
exactly. You're not allowed to drive anything older than a 2021.
I think the guy that's doing the test probably comes in with like a black drape and just lays it over the screen.
Guaranteed.
Oh, yeah. I still
Guaranteed.
remember when I first bought that rodeo I was telling them about earlier. It'd probably been 10 years since I drove a stick shift. And then I went in and I was like, let me try that out. And I jumped into first I'm like, oh man, it's been 10 years since I've had to use
This could be a little
clutch.
rusty.
Give me a second here. Yeah. I somehow didn't stall it out, but I came close a couple times.
That's good. That's good. Like, I always try to tie things back to them. And I think Jack will still have to learn how to drive. That's my, he's 12. So he'll have to learn how to drive, but my nieces and nephews may not have to.
Might be on borrowed time for some folks.
Yeah. Isn't that weird to think about?
That's really weird.
Everybody, thank you again for tuning in. I've really enjoyed our time here with Josh. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come. And Blair as well, thank you for joining in today and sharing your expertise as well. So again, if you liked a lot of what you heard here, go back, listen to some of our previous episodes. You can also check out the Tech Talk that Blair and Josh and Evangelos were on earlier today. That'll be available on our YouTube channel. Until next time, thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Josh and Josh.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.